Hello, I'm Cameo George, executive producer of American Experience, PBS's flagship and longest running history series. Thank you for being here. Past Forward Conversations with American Experience is our monthly virtual series where we discuss themes in our films with historians and experts. Today's Past Forward conversation explores how perceptions of the female body can impact healthcare outcomes for women. It is inspired in part by our latest film, The Cancer Detectives, which is streaming now on our website, on our YouTube channel, and in the PBS app. The Cancer Detectives tells the story of the first ever war on cancer and the coalition of people who fought tirelessly to save women's lives, including a Greek immigrant, Dr. George Papanikolaou, his intrepid wife, Mary, Japanese-born artist Hashime Murayama, Dr. Helen Dickens, an African-American OBGYN in Philadelphia, and an entirely new class of female scientists. In today's conversation, our guests will address the emotions of shame and concealment that have shrouded the female body, discussing how these perceptions can be informed by the race and class of the women involved. They will also examine how stigma, ignorance, and bias can either prevent women from seeking proper care or keep them from receiving it when they do. As always, this is meant to be an interactive conversation. I invite you to write questions in the live chat. We'll answer as many as possible during the discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our corporate sponsors, Liberty Mutual Insurance and Carlisle Companies. I'd also like to acknowledge the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the GBH Voices and Equity Fund, members of the Better Angel Society, including the Fullerton Family Charitable Fund, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the American Experience Trust, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, our home station, GBH, and of course, viewers like you. Now it is my privilege to introduce our panel for this conversation. Ameenah Shakir is a 20th century U.S. historian of race and medicine. Her work has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities and explores the intersection of race, medicine, and gender. She is currently working on a book entitled Birthing Liberation, a biography of Dr. Helen Dickens, the Black physician activist featured in our film, who worked to desegregate medical education. Kat Bohannon is a researcher and author with a Ph.D. from Columbia University, where she studied narrative and cognition. Her first book, Eve, How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Human Evolution, is a New York Times bestseller, a Foyle's 2023 Nonfiction Book of the Year, and a finalist for the Women's Prize. Her essays and poems have appeared in The Atlantic and Scientific American, among other publications. The conversation will be moderated by Pam Belloc. Pam is a New York Times staff writer whose honors include a Pulitzer Prize and the Victor Cohn Prize for Excellence in Medical Science Reporting. She writes about a range of health and medical subjects, and her work has been chosen for the Best American Science Writing Award. Thank you again for joining us, and please enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Cameo, and welcome, Ameenah and Kat. I am honored to be here with you today to talk about the ways that our perceptions of women's bodies can affect women's health care. This discussion is inspired in part by the American Experience's new film, The Cancer Detectives, now streaming on YouTube, pbs.org, and the PBS app. So let's get started. Ameenah, women's bodies have long been the subject of debate, exploration, admiration, and contempt. Specifically in the field of medicine, what are some common themes that we've seen in how the female body has been discussed?
Yeah, so when we think about the 20th century, which is the area that I largely work in, the early to mid 20th century, a lot of those themes, specifically as they have to deal with African American women, which is the area of my research, are largely about kind of the hypersexualization and objectification, and also experimentation on Black women's bodies, right? These are really rooted in much longer stereotypes, negative stereotypes about Black women that really thought about Black women in terms of popular literature, writing, also in medical science, as not experiencing pain at the same level, of being only kind of tools for production and reproduction. And so that hypersexualization then we see in the 20th century continuing as doctors oftentimes are interacting Black women patients in their offices, right? So this has a very long history that is really connected to some of those ideas of kind of this racialization of Black women's bodies in particular.
Yeah, and I noticed when watching the Cancer Detectives something I didn't know, which was that people thought for a while that Black women didn't get cancer. I found that to be very troubling and extraordinary. Kat, notions of the female body as somehow weaker or more fragile than the male body have been explained in the past as a natural evolutionary fact. Is this true? And if it's not, where did
No,
those ideas come from?
no, that's a big old bag of nope, which is increasingly clear in the biological sciences. No, female bodies are by no means more fragile than male bodies, but it's not just in human beings. This is true across many different mammals. But I'll talk about human beings because we are them and we think about ourselves a lot. Okay, so males across their lifespan get more infections. Turns out this is recent research from birth forward. And it's true in global data too, not just in the United States. And it's not just diagnosis bias. The signal's too strong. And when they get those diagnoses, their prognoses tend to be a little bit worse. They also get more cancer for a variety of reasons across their lifespan. When they get their prognoses tends to be a little bit worse. And likewise, across many male mammals and female mammals in many species, turns out males die sooner. That's just a thing. We used to think it was about behavior, like Jackass the movie, but make it lions or something, right? But no, actually, it seems to be about the immune system. It seems to be about cellular repair. It goes deep, deep into the body. Actually, it seems to be, if you're a mammal, there's an innate male vulnerability. Females are better at not dying. And so being able to get the data to support that idea meant pushing past the paradigm that females are weak. It meant actually looking into the differences as they lie in the data before you and not just assuming it must be an artifact or something like that. Where do these stories come from? Sexism. I mean, they come from sexism. We can call a thing, right? And then it intersects with racism, and then it's just a hot bag of awful. But if that's where the stories come from, well, when we can acknowledge that males are vulnerable, then we can start to fix things and get better healthcare for all of us.
And how do these kinds of gender biases continue to shape medical research and medical treatment? I mean, we've had, these physicians who were male who sort of established the field of gynecology, but they did so almost with this sort of sense of disgust for the female organs. And you get this sense that this was something that they didn't really want to be acknowledging, that they didn't really want to be treating. And I'm interested, maybe first you, Kat, and then Ameenah, how this origin of the field of gynecology and the way that women's bodies were perceived affect medical research and healthcare.
I mean, the incredible, horrific history, at least in the 20th century and just before, of what we now call gynecology is finally being brought to light. And a lot of that was real terrible. Let's never do that again to female patients. I think one of the things, I'll be honest, I'm a little conflicted. right? Because I'm a researcher and I am a woman, cis woman, queer, but whatever, right? But not all my ideas come from my boobs. So there's this idea that like I would have ideas that specifically are because I'm female that I feel conflicted about. At the same time, I can see that it's been such an incredible win for women and people of color to be in the sciences, obviously, for all of the reasons. And lots of fantastic research pushing against social paradigms has come from that. So let's call it a win and let's admit that our ideas don't come from our boobs at the same time.
And Ameenah, what are your thoughts about that? How specifically this sort of gendered creation field, we're going to talk more about race later, which obviously intersects with all of this, but I'm interested in how you think the kind of male-centric origin of this field has affected what we know and don't know about women's bodies and how to treat them.
Yeah, so I think in the 20th century, the male centeredness in terms of the professional development of the field, how it really provides another space for men as they're going into other industries and other professions to really kind of carve out obstetrics and gynecology as their space, even though this ultimately leads to the kind of erasure of the practice of obstetrics and gynecology by women who we know as early as the 19th century, this was really kind of their domain, right? And so we see this kind of parallel between not only notions of what is professional, what are kind of these male spaces, and then how those get claimed and reclaimed ultimately by women, but that they were always there as practitioners, right? And also as patients, but the kind of popular narrative that kind of erases them from obstetrics and gynecology, but also leads to this medicalization of the practice of birthing, of labor, as women are erased from the profession as practitioners.
Oh, that's really interesting. And how does it shape what patients ask about and even know to inquire about, and what providers know to sort of look for?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so, oh, sorry.
Oh,
Either
you go
one.
first, please.
No, I was just, I was just gonna say, I mean, I think one of the things is that as you have the kind of rise in the production of kind of medical knowledge in women's literature, women's periodical literature. You see also women patients asking for certain procedures or writing and talking amongst each other within space in women's clubs, women's movements. And so there is still an effort on the part of patients, even though there's a particular popular medical narrative, there's still this perception of women about things that they actually want physicians to do, or practices that they want to actually have as they're visiting their physician.
Yeah,
And
I think
Kat?
that's absolutely right. And tying it into this idea of the stories that we take on from the culture around us. For we now know that women's pain is taken less seriously in the clinic today as it was historically, taken less seriously, misbelieved, disbelieved, just not a good situation. If you've got pain, you come into a clinic. Is your doctor going to take it seriously? Are you going to get the treatments you need? And that intersects even more so with the history of racism, which of course we'll talk about more. So you end up with this situation where female patients come in, especially in an OB practice or a gynecology practice, with this kind of diffuse pain, which can be associated with ovarian cancer, sometimes cervical cancer. You have some bleeding out of your cycle. Well, that happens, right? You've got some kind of, is it gas or is it pain kind of thing happening? Well, that happens. And you've taken on this story that your pain doesn't matter because you're female. You don't want to be a wimp, right? So maybe you muscle up and you try and prove that you're not a wimp, but then you don't advocate for yourself, right? So it can be a really vicious cycle when these stories are the dominant things we tell ourselves, excuse me, when these stories are the dominant things we tell ourselves about our bodies.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. So we've talked about some of the narratives that shape our understanding of the female body in medicine, how that might affect patients and healthcare. Let's take a look at a clip now from The Cancer Detectives, where we see how the inventor of the Pap test, Dr. George Papanikolaou, and his wife and collaborator Mary overcame social attitudes in order to make a crucial medical discovery. Let's watch now.
There was this repeated association of female genitals with something that you should hide and cover up. Every time a usually male anatomist would discover the clitoris or the vulva, they would name it after the word shame. So in the 1500s, a French anatomist studied the human clitoris and he named it the shame member. We still have today in OBGYN textbooks this word pudendum, which means the part for which you should be ashamed.
For the Papanikolaous, nothing about their new work was shameful. We stand at the very threshold, George would explain, of this new science. Now, George was hoping to expand the study beyond what he termed his special case. Soon, there were rumors that if you went to the Paps for dinner, female guests might be asked to sit for a smear.
Mary herself was fundamental in recruiting some of her friends to come and get smear tests in the name of medical progress. It's difficult to kind of piece together exactly how those initial smear parties really happened, but I think what we can say is that George was very keen on expanding this sample size.
In February 1925, George was finally able to establish a collaboration with the Women's Hospital of the City of New York.
So we started looking at cysts, started looking at fibroid matters, trying to figure out if there was a correlation between these changes in the cells and the diseases that women were experiencing.
Then, one day at the microscope, Dr. Pap saw something altogether different. A sample with cells oddly shaped, their nuclei overlarge, their chromosomes jumbled. There was no mistaking those distinctive signs. It was cancer.
This was not what George was looking for. But so much of good science is about luck and opportunity and incidental findings, and George, being a keen and perceptive scientist, must have known the significance of what he has detected.
Kat, we see in that clip that breaking through barriers of secrecy was key for the Paps to make the discoveries that they did that led to the Pap smear. What do you think their breakthrough says about the scientific importance of challenging stigmas around women's bodies?
You can't have findings if you don't have data. It's just like that, you know? And if you can't have findings if you don't have data, then you absolutely need to have more representative bodies of subjects, right? Even today, it's still true that women are under-enrolled in phase 1 clinical trials. That's a problem.
Yes, that's true. And also there's so little testing and trial inclusion of women in pregnancy. There's so much that we don't know about drugs and treatments on women in pregnancy. And that's a huge uncharted area. Ameenah, we also hear in this clip, how it talks a lot about how shame has been attached to the female anatomy. But, the citations mentioned are mostly European. And I'm wondering if you can help us understand how those kinds of perceptions differed, if they did, for women of color and for poorer women.
Yeah, so when we think about African American women, as I was mentioning before, we do know that there's a whole counter narrative here about how Black women are viewed as overly sexualized, hypersexualized, and experimented on as a result. And so the way that that kind of manifests in some of those narratives that Black women have about bodies is that they're really concerned about a kind of politics of respectability in their medical care and visits to medical doctors. Black doctors like Dr. Helen Dickens were extremely aware of this. And so that she tried to make sure that in all of her encounters with her patients that she was hypersensitive to this notion that Black women perhaps would not want to talk about sexual objectification or even just basic things about their bodies. And so you see in a lot of her writings on in workshops about uterine cancer early on, she is very careful about walking a very tight line about how she's describing the work that she's doing, right? That so she's not explicitly mentioning genitalia or even other reproductive organs. She might just say, like in the Philadelphia Tribune, she might just do an article saying cancer in women, right? It's extremely vague because she's thinking about these women in many cases perhaps have been victimized in many ways or hypersexualized. And so she wants to create an alternative space where they don't have that shame and that they are really seen as holistic people and patients.
She just sounds remarkable, Dr. Dickens, and it's really about earning trust, right? It's really, I mean, these are situations where women are at their most vulnerable and exposed, and it sounds like it's the key thing there is that she created this atmosphere where people felt respected, and they felt like they could trust her. You know, we've come some way, I think, in society to dealing with stigma and shame, but we're still certainly not there yet. What would each of you say, Ameenah, maybe you can start first, some ways that you think the medical community can do better in helping overcome the stigma and shame about women's bodies?
Yeah, so one of the things ways I think that the medical community could do better is in having more kind of cultural competency in their actual training and understanding that patients are coming with different points of view, that they have different cultural ideas that they're holding with them about their bodies. And so being aware of those, but also kind of rethinking the ways in which we think about public health, the way we think about advocacy, and the spaces in which that actually occurs. And so I think really kind of broadening those ideas and providing a wider range of spaces where we think about patient advocacy and actually meeting patients where they are, I think is a way to really kind of improve the medical profession, but also that ties back into who are the people that are actually practicing the medicine and what are they being taught in medical school. And then how is that then being connected to, other things like the social determinants of health and all these other things that we know really matter in terms of patient viability.
Right. Kat, do you
Yeah.
want to offer some ideas along those lines as well?
I mean, first I want to second everything that Ameenah said, which is so well said and so true. I think being in a clinic and talking about your body is a moment of vulnerability, whether or not you're in the stirrups. But for those of us who have been in the stirrups, it's just another layer. That's like, once your ankles are actually, you're more vulnerable, okay? Because it's your badge. It's a thing. So if you have one. So so you have to be able to acknowledge that vulnerability on both sides, both the patient admitting okay, here I'm at. Yeah, I'm all right. And the doctor as well. But it goes broader. It goes into public policy. It goes into who gets trained. One of the things that we're just finally starting to talk about right now is not only that there is such a breakdown between female patients and clinicians, a breakdown in perceptions of trust on both sides, a breakdown in what gets believed and what doesn't, what creates policy, but also that 81% of healthcare decisions in the United States are made by women. Okay? And I'm not talking about just their bodies, but because sexism, caretakers, right? So we're caring for children more often than not. We are caring for medically frail family members. We are caring for elderly parents, and we are making medical decisions for them, which is to say, the single most effective space to intervene here is getting women to trust the science more and getting clinicians and medical researchers to trust women more. That's the fulcrum. That's the best way to improve American healthcare for all bodies, because women are the deciders 81% of the time, which is phenomenal. It's a huge opportunity, but we're going to have to come at it from like 50 different angles. There's no one thing that's going to do it. It's not just the internet's fault, right? It's going to be a lot of stuff. But when we say that's what we're trying to fix, then we can get somewhere.
Okay, so we talked a little bit, Ameenah did, about how Dr. Helen Dickens built this just kind of remarkable way of communicating and earning trust with patients. We're going to watch a clip now from the Cancer Detectives, where we'll see Dr. Dickens and also Dr. Virginia Alexander and how they worked to build a community-based center that helped provide care to expecting mothers in a way that they were treated with dignity and with respect. Let's watch that clip now.
Now, age 26, Dickens had taken a job in North Philadelphia, working with a doctor who would change the course of her career.
Virginia Alexander, African-American woman, physician who had something called the Aspirant Health Home. This was similar to what we would now call a birthing home.
The patients came to us. She had 2 rooms in her house for patients and 1 little room where you delivered patients. Oh, it was different. The OB patients stayed in 9 days. Most of them were poor. People weren't able to pay. They weren't expecting to pay a lot.
Esperanto was a world unto itself in a segregated society.
It's not as if Black people can just go to the county hospital. You have to go to the hospital for the Negro. And oftentimes they're underfunded, they're understaffed. The chief physicians tend to be white men. And there is a condescension that goes on, a kind of patronizing attitude.
So Dickens and Alexander really provide this alternative. Alexander helped Dickens to reformulate a consciousness around how healthcare could be used as a site of activism.
Beyond the walls of the Esperanto Health Home, Dr. Dickens was working more and more out in the community.
Going in the middle of the night, and you were going in all kinds of communities. You were going into homes, you were seeing all these people. You were taking responsibility for care of people.
The more she was in it with the women she came across, the more she knew about what their struggles and concerns were health-wise.
One of the things that Dickens saw again and again was cancer. Her patients were dying, and she now knew that the perception that Black people didn't get cancer was a lie. Dickens was determined to document cancer's deadly toll and to tell Black women what they so urgently needed to know.
Ameenah, you've done a lot of work on looking into the work that Dr. Dickens did. The Esperanto Health Home really played an all too rare part in providing this kind of care to Black women. I'm wondering how you think that the ethos of the health home differed from other institutions that were providing care, and how that was important, and what lessons we can maybe learn from that model or that approach in today's world.
Yeah, so one of the major differences of Virginia Alexander's Aspirant Health Home as opposed to going into a segregated hospital was that, first of all, your partner was allowed to be there with you during labor and delivery, which was very uncommon during the 1920s and 30s, which is when this health home is founded initially by Dr. Virginia Alexander. And also that, as you hear Dickens saying in the clip there, that women were actually allowed to stay as long as 9 to 10 days, in some cases longer. During that time, they did not have to worry about anything. They had 24-hour care with nurses. Their meals were provided. And so they also were kind of provided like birthing classes, for lack of better words, right, about how to actually care for a baby. So there was a lot of kind of what we would now today call kind of wraparound services, holistic, the kind of going back to use of doulas and other forms of holistic medical care. That was integrated within the Esperanto Health Home. Also, Alexander, her plan was initially to try to purchase other homes on the street and convert those into what she would have considered like a community of clinics, right? So that there would be birthing centers and then other types of centers there. She's ultimately not able to do that because she leaves the practice to Helen and ultimately goes to graduate school and then later goes on to work at Howard University and as a physician there. Dr. Vanessa Northington Gamble is writing a really good biography about Alexander and her work and how it's really embedded in a kind of larger context, political context that's going on in the Northeast at that time. So some of the ways I think this can really be a model for today, if we look at a lot of the birthing homes that we have now, they are really about, right, a kind of demedicalization of birthing, right? And Alexander really understood this attunely. And Dickens really kind of takes up the mantle of that practice and then starts her own practice later in North Philadelphia.
They were really pioneers in that model, which is just so important now. We talked a bit about how Dr. Dickens earned the trust of patients, and Dr. Alexander, they earned the trust of their patients, but it can be equally important for medical professionals to trust their patients' instincts and to listen to them. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that plays out, in particular in the Black community. Whether there is enough of that trusting and sort of acknowledging and recognizing and validating what patients say.
Yeah, I really think with Dickens, we see here, because she's not just doing this work in isolation, she's working with other Black women doctors, but also Black male doctors as well. But one of her major collaborators in really publicizing the Pap smear and increasing the kind of utilization of obstetric and gynecological care by Black women is working with other Black lay women. So many of these women were perhaps wives of physicians. Other women may have been in various forms of civil service work, but they were in club women's organizations and largely in churches. because many of these clinics that Dickens actually starts early on, she's partnering with established Black women's groups, social, political groups that are working largely through churches, right? And so if we take that model of how these women have very particular concerns about wanting the most modern healthcare, that Dickens is trusting that they know what they're talking about, and that she's expanding that. So I definitely think that's one way that we can continue to expand the kind of utilization of care is by really believing patients when they're saying, okay, you might think this is important as a physician, but me as a patient, this is what actually impacts my life, right? So I definitely think that she's a model for perhaps ways that we can continue to see that, and that we do see some of that collaboration today between patients and physicians.
Yeah,
I think
no, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, I think that's such a beautiful model. And I also think the idea of who healthcare belongs to and what does buy-in really look like in a community, and how can that be mobilized in communities today across many diverse communities in the United States, you know? What does it mean to say the healthcare of my community belongs to all of us, right? And how can that actually be empowered in really material ways? Even the simplicity of connecting with the local church groups, yes, is actually a thing. There are many, many ways. It's also true in the medical community itself. I mean, there are practicalities to shift changes at hospitals. One of the big challenges with OB is that chicks give birth at night. It's a thing. Just statistically, for some reason, our bodies just want to do that in really awkward hours. That's just a thing. Any OB will tell you that, which of course means that being a practicing OB, your schedule is, it's a whole thing, right? But that means that, like, if you have better culture in the hospital, when you have a shift change, you'll have more of a sense of buy-in between the nurses, maybe not having all the nurses rotate at the same time as the docs, and vice versa, right? Like, who's in charge of one patient's care, right? And is that patient's care connected maybe to a doula, or maybe connected to that out of hospital care that's happened all before and will continue to happen after? There are ways in to create that buy-in, but you have to want that as your goal to take the real lessons forward here from what we're seeing from Ameenah.
Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting about these two examples that we've been talking about, the PAPs and their development of the Pap smear and the obstacles they overcome, and Dr. Dickens, Dr. Alexander, is that they're contributing, they're advancing medicine, but they're also using medicine in a way as activism. I wonder if either of you or both of you can sort of think of ways. First of all, do you think that's an important role for medicine, and do you see ways that medicine can play that activist role nowadays, and where should it be doing that?
Well, I definitely think as it relates to Black women, that we still have this issue, because if we look at the maternal mortality crisis right now that is plaguing Black women in particular, right, we know that medicine, and particularly labor and delivery, is still an area that needs an activist call, right, and demands it for the safety and protection of Black life. And so if we're thinking about that, and we have these very critical ways in which we understand that with the maternal mortality crisis, we definitely know that there is still a need for the dismantling of the systems of race and racism that make that crisis happen, right? Because there's lots and lots of research that demonstrates for us it's not that there is something innately wrong with Black women. It's the ways in which race and racism make those Black women's bodies be treated in those medical spaces. And so that this is fundamentally, if we're talking about life, which we are, this is fundamentally the most significant way in which, we have to remain activists in this space.
And Ameenah, that answer is just dovetails perfectly into our first audience question. You've touched on this a bit, but I wonder if you want to expand a bit. The audience question is, can you talk about how not knowing enough about women's bodies can impact maternal mortality, particularly Black maternal mortality?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely, as I was just saying, it's not just not knowing enough about women's bodies, it's the ways in which race and racism functions in the medical system and is embedded into medical care. And so then we have this outcome, this negative outcome of Black maternal mortality, right? Not because there's something, as I said before, innately wrong with Black women, but there's something wrong with the system that does not recognize, see, acknowledge, or even honor the lives of Black women and their babies. And so I think that's a much larger and deeper question about how do we deconstruct that system, or provide barriers within the system that help to protect Black life.
Okay. And Kat, I know. Go ahead. Yes, if you want to talk about the question about activism, that would be great. And I also think this next audience question is a good one for you to tackle. So,
I think
question, I'll just read it, and then, what is one myth about women's bodies that you've come across in your research that you'd like to dispel?
All right. I'm gonna speak to Ameenah's wonderful points quickly, and then, So I think institutionalized racism absolutely runs deep. The roots are everywhere, and it's going to take quite a while to rout. But as a purposeful goal, if we all have buy-in, then I think it is achievable. God damn it. So I think that was going to take a long time. I think that it's also important to acknowledge, because this is one of those myths, that somehow the female body is innately good at giving birth, making babies, that we are just born baby making ready. And as long as we just get out of the way, then this body is just going to do that thing and no one's going to suffer. No, 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 no. Female human beings have pregnancies and births and postpartum recoveries that are longer and harder and more prone to horrible complications than they are for most any other primate. And we are primates, most any other mammal, actually. So no, it's not the case that our innate beautiful strength will somehow save us from hemorrhage. We could use some help with that stuff. It's also true that when you arrive in this scenario of institutionalized racism, if you have a body that has been in any way predisposed towards cardiovascular mayhem, if you can dispel the myth that pregnancy is good for you, then maybe you're going to have a better lookout for cardiovascular mayhem. Maybe you're going to be better looking for these outcomes, right? In all bodies, not just white bodies, right? So that's a major myth I would love to dispel. Most births aren't going to kill you if you have one, but man, gynecology helps for that outcome.
Yes, definitely. And, I think we haven't talked here about mental health and the role that plays in women's health and in pregnancy and postpartum experience for a lot of women. Do either of you want to tackle that while we're waiting for our next audience question?
At the point of postpartum mental health, or do you mean mental health across the lifespan? That's different, right? So,
well, across the lifespan, but also perinatal mental health, which is, I think, very stigmatized and understudied.
Absolutely. I think it's so important to remember that the brain is an organ. And when stuff goes down in the brain, you should treat it like any other organ that's having some trouble. It shouldn't receive special status. And the maternal body deserves to have all of its organs working as well as possible during the mayhem that is pregnancy. So I had wonderful treatment from my care team when I was pregnant. I did have some peripartum and some postpartum depression, and I had excellent care for it. And I thank goodness every day that that was something that I benefited from. I know a lot of people don't because of stigma, because of secrecy, and again, because of this idea that we're supposed to just be so innately good at baby making, we with the uteri.
Ameenah, do you want to add anything to that?
No.
Okay. So this next question, I guess this was something that I raised, but either of you can talk about it. Why is a lack of pregnant women in clinical trials a problem?
You want to go, Ameenah?
So
we can both do it. But go ahead.
not just in not just pregnant women, but a lack of women in trials, period, is a problem because the ways in which hormone production functions for women's bodies and is connected to a range of things, not just pregnancy. But if we don't have any women who are participating in those trials, and I can understand, right, why particularly Black women, also Latino women and others, why they do not participate in trials because of the history of medical experimentation. I completely understand that, right? But the converse of that is, or not converse, the issue is that if you don't have women in clinical trials, then you also kind of get a kind of replication of some of the practices that don't actually work for women's bodies, right? So because of the ways in which hormones function. I mean, one good thing I think recently is that you have had more of a kind of resurgence or understanding about why we need to talk about hormone production in women's bodies, but you still don't really see that when we're talking about pregnancy.
Right. And,
Yeah,
there's some differences, right? Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Kat.
There are absolutely some critical differences in what goes down in the body, especially in the immune system, actually, when your body is pregnant versus when a body is not pregnant, but you also have the ovaries, right? So there's this important down regulation of the immune system that happens in a pregnant body, which is that interaction of the placenta and the rest of the body, right? We have very poor models for exactly how this works. We have very poor models for exactly what happens when stuff goes wrong around that central issue, right? We just know kind of broad strokes of like, well, try not to get the flu if you're pregnant. That's a thing. I'd love to know more about why so that we could better help chicks when they get the flu when they're pregnant. So we need to simply know more across the board, across a woman's lifespan, which for the majority of cis women will include a pregnancy at some point.
Right. And just what medications are safe to take and not take during pregnancy is still something that, that we just don't know a lot about. The next question is really an interesting one. I think both of you will have thoughtful things to say about it. How does classism enter into this conversation of women's health? Ameenah, do you want to start?
Oh, sure. So I definitely think just with thinking about what Dickens was doing, she really tried to get around the issues of classism while at the same time being very aware of how that was driving her practice. So, for instance, she really marketed a lot of her services to middle class and elite Black women. She was able to do that because she was practicing in Philadelphia, which one of the longest kind of Black elite populations here in the U.S. So she's marketing to them, but then she's also providing free services as much as she can for women who obviously would not, due to their financial situation, would not have been able to afford medical care, particularly obstetric and gynecological care. So even today, I think that we still see, even in some of the debates around who uses doulas, who uses midwives, where do they have clearance to be able to practice? Do they have hospital affiliation? The whole idea today of a birthing home in many ways is it's kind of a ethos of a middle class elite background. And so although the kind of pioneers of that are not really thinking of it in that way, that's kind of how it manifests itself today. So I definitely think that there is a kind of it's kind of rife with classism when we're thinking about who gets to deliver a baby, how and where and in what circumstances. I definitely think is one of the challenges. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I
Oh
agree with
God,
that.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I strongly agree too. There's also that thing about how far do you literally live from a hospital? And does that hospital have a fully rigged maternity ward or not? That's a thing literally not all American women have easy access to. So, yeah, there's that. And that whole idea of have you been a good patient and come to all of your prenatal meetings? Yeah, a lot of your life may have gone into making those decisions, whether or not you were available, whether or not you had to work, right? That's very much a thing. And don't get me started on the breastfeeding conversation, because that has very much become a domain of some rather wealthy women in this country who have been not very nice, particularly online, to people who have had no choice but to make other choices around breastfeeding.
Yeah, and you know, you were talking about the availability of maternity wards. I mean, those are closing across the country, particularly in rural and underserved areas. All right, we have one more question, another really interesting one that I think both of you can speak to here. What are the ways that age plays a role? What are the different issues for younger women versus older women? Question. Ameenah, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Well, we're different at different ages. Let's see. Okay, I'll try a stab. I'll try a quick stab. I can do this, right? All right. So one of the things that I think has been really, really important in STI research, so sexually transmitted infections, is all of the new awareness that we have about the sex lives of postmenopausal people, particularly geriatric people who live in nursing homes. Now, there have been a lot of bad jokes made about the sex lives of grandma once she goes over there. Personally, full support. Just saying, if that's part of what she wants, she should have that. And he as well. But the thing is that we actually didn't know a lot about what gonorrhea looked like in a person who was 80, because we had never studied that. Because of shame, we had never talked about that. So we're only just now on the science side, I mean, on the medical side, starting to get a sense of what treatments are going to be more or less effective for people at different ages when they continue to have sex lives. The only way we were able to get past that was getting past the stigma of it all. So I think that's a really cool future area of research, no matter how uncomfortable it might make some people feel.
Right. Ameenah, do you want to add to the age question, or should I pivot to the
I'm
last
not
question?
sure. Are they asking about is there a difference in the way that uterine or ovarian cancer functions or are they talking about pregnancy? I'm not sure what they mean about
Yeah, I think you could take it any way you want, but the way I'm sort of thinking about it is sort of our discussion about how women are treated, you know, as patients when they're older versus younger. You know, I think that's kind of interesting. And also, you know, our medical
okay.
needs get a lot more complex, right? I mean, you know, age. I mean, we're all living longer. Women are living longer than men, and age brings about a host of things that complicate, you know, some of the female specific things that we have going on in our bodies too. So I just think it's an interesting.
Yeah, I think that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about some of the newer research now about whether hormone replacement therapy is good or bad, or how that's connected to cancer, you know, right? So I could think of it kind of like that in a sense, right? Because for a very long time, people just, physicians in particular, researchers were not really thinking about how do you really bring new awareness or create new medical knowledge about the function of kind of hormone production across menopausal women's lifespan, right? There's such an emphasis on um, younger women having a baby in a certain, I mean, but we could also see this connected to some of the other questions now about infertility, right? And how that also has a kind of class and also age component to it, as women have more options professionally, and a lot of the very problematic rhetoric around how women are treated as they may be engaging in some types of fertility treatments, for instance.
Yeah, totally. All right. So final question for each of you. Let's sort of zoom out. And what is, if you had to think of one thing that you consider the most important thing that we can do to improve women's awareness of healthcare issues and the outcomes that they have, what would it be? If you have more than one, you can throw it in.
I would say be mindful of the doctor that you're choosing, because I think ultimately the doctor is going to be your advocate, but also as much as you can having some type of knowledge on your own about the ways in which the type of practitioner that you would like to have. Because I still think the kind of first line of who your physician is really matters. But I also think continuing to try to have very broad forms of healthcare that can ensure all people, regardless of their ability to pay, all of those types of things, I think are continued. That's more than one. That's like five, but those are my thoughts.
That's okay. Those are all really good thoughts.
Real, just like solve this giant problem real quick on this TV show. I'm sure you can, just like real quick in a sentence. You could do that, right? Yeah. I think you did great. I think seconding all of this, I think something that's really, really important is remembering that the goal is to create buy-in. Okay. You want your physician to have buy-in to your case. And by your case, I literally mean your body and why you've arrived at the clinic. Okay. That's a thing. Whatever clinic you're going to, that's your case. You want your physician to have buy-in, but you also, as a physician, want your patient to have buy-in to the whole decision-making process of what to do. Because your job then as a physician is to provide the information as you see it and guidance as you can, but knowing that there are decisions to make, right? That this person's going to leave this room and have a life, some of which will involve treatment, some of which will not, right? So that means that physicians need to be way less patronizing, as do scientists, right? This idea that somehow women, who again are the deciders 81% of the time, are somehow bad at deciding, are somehow just too dumb to get it, is not helping at all, not creating the buy-in at all, and not accurate most of the time. So that's one thing that could be done easily. Just be less of a jerk about it.
Okay. I love that. That'll be our motto. Be less of a jerk. Thank you so much to both of you for participating in this really fascinating conversation. Thank you to our audience for joining and for asking really thoughtful questions. And I'm now going to pass it back to Cameo for closing remarks. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today for this conversation exploring how perceptions of the female body impact women's health. The Cancer Detectives is now available to stream in full on our website, our YouTube channel, and on the PBS app. You can watch our past forward conversations anytime on our YouTube channel or on our website. And if you liked what you saw today, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for our events newsletter. You'll be the first to know about new conversations, opportunities to watch new films live with us, and more. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great day.